Alrighty, it is 7:08, so it's safe to assume that Friday night people have better things to be doing than jumping on a study group call. But like I said, missed a couple of weeks, uh, the last couple of weeks, so making up for it by doing double weeks this weekend, next week. So hope to get back on track with the weekly meetings going forward. But this is the last of the sports psychology section, or the month of June, now catching up into July. And we'll be moving into nutrition with the next month of July, and then hopefully get caught up so that it doesn't spill over into August. But the topic this week within sports psychology is personality, and this is something that I definitely nerded out or nerded out on when I was in grad school. Personality is just something that's always kind of grabbed my attention, or something that I've always thought was interesting and valuable to understand. Definitely within not only understanding athletes, but people in a larger context of society as a whole. So, to give the overview for the topic of personality, the way that I think about it is there's different models of personality, and there's different ways to conceptualize it. And some of these are more or less backed by science. Some were created pretty much out of thin air, but there were different ways of arriving upon basically these different models of understanding personality. And like I said, some are backed more or rooted more in science, but they all kind of arrive up at the more or less the same thing. The biggest difference being whether they are intrinsic traits or learned skills. But for the most part, a lot of these terminology, there's slight nuance in the semantics of everything. There's different words to describe similar traits. So like I said, they all arrive at basically the same conclusion. But then we'll get into some helpful and hurtful traits, and this is a little bit of a tricky uh, kind of subject to navigate, because everything is so dependent on the context for that individual within their sporting environment. And so it's really hard to say that anything is always helpful or always hurtful, but rather it's more a matter of what the research would suggest is consistently seen within like successful or unsuccessful athletes. And then lastly, we'll talk about the sport specific skills that are considered to be personality traits, but aren't necessarily things that are measured through personality psychology, things that are talked about commonly in athletics, things like an athlete having a clutch trait, or having maybe mental toughness, things along those lines. So to start, we'll talk about the different models of personality. And so the Myers-Briggs test was basically inspired by Carl Jung's work. And so this is basically they took, I think it was four different traits, and they just gave a positive and negative dimension. And they just said whether or not you were basically you were an introvert or an extrovert. And so what it does is it calculates based on these kind of sliding scales where you kind of fit into society, if you're more introverted, if you're more extroverted. And I don't remember off the top of my head all of the different topics or dimensions that they measure, but effectively it was just using Carl Jung's personality theory to then put it into a mass test. And so this is one that wasn't necessarily validated through science, but it was kind of created over time as personality psychology started to unfold. This is similar to the 16 personalities, which was inspired by Raymond Cattell's work. And so this one was just slightly different in the sense that it was effectively you arrive at the same 16 personalities because of the four different dimensions or four different traits. And this one was more of let me close out of that quick. It's telling me that nobody's here. I already knew that nobody was here. Okay, so the 16 personalities is effectively more of a slider scale, and so it's kind of saying maybe you're more of this, but you also have a bit of this. It's not always just a black and white. You are an introvert or you are an extrovert. It's kind of what do all of the interactions of all of your different personality types, what does that give you? So how do you take your personality traits into society, and how does that lead to your interactions with different people? The Enneagram model is a slightly different version, but effectively it's measuring 9 different dimensions of basically interactions in human behavior. So things like leadership, perfectionism, it's not necessarily the same traits that have been previously identified, but rather it's kind of the behavioral psychology side of things, where it's how do you actually interact. And then lastly, and this is probably the most referred to or the most popularized, is the Factor Five model. And this is probably most popular because it was so scientifically rooted. And so effectively, they took I won't remember the word now, lexical approach, where they basically just did a brainstorm and asked everybody to describe each other. And so they came up with all these different descriptors for how people act. And through that, then they eliminated some of the redundancy, and they basically clustered in all of the words that were synonymous. So, for example, if somebody said this person is really confident, then you could lump that in with somebody being not anxious, or secure in themselves, something like that. And so what they arrived at was, originally I think it was 10. I can't remember now. It's been too long since I've looked at the development of this model, but I believe it was like a list of like 400 words, and then it basically boiled down into 20 or so, and then it continued to get distilled down into, I think it was 10, and then finally it was derived down into 5 descriptors. And so this was ultimately what it resulted in, is that ocean. Uh, wow, I am struggling with words today. The acronym, there's the word. So it's the openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness, and then neuroticism was the previous term. I believe they changed that recently because neuroticism has such a negative connotation to it. So I think they changed it to a more neutral term, and I believe they use emotionality, because it's not necessarily that neuroticism is always negative or it's a bad trait to have, but it's rather, how do you experience emotions? Do you feel very strong emotions with interactions, or do you feel very little emotion when things occur? And so like I said, this is probably the most utilized because they considered it to be a strong foundation to base future research. And so a lot of sports psychology research is utilizing this Factor Five model to then expand upon, with basically, okay, well, how do winners and losers differ amongst these personality traits? And there are a few that jump out, but it's not necessarily a direct correlation. It's not a 1-to-1. If you have this trait, you're going to win. If you have this trait, you're going to lose. So we'll talk about that a little bit more in depth here. And so typically what you see in the literature is that traits like conscientiousness, I think this is the one that is the most consistent for athletic success, is conscientiousness. And basically what that is dedication, kind of rule following, or a sense of regulation, where I know what I need to do and I'm going to do it. And so that trait kind of makes sense, right? It's like the hard work, or it's the 1,000 hours kind of a idea or philosophy, where if you put in the work, you will get better, and then you will outperform your competitors. So the next trait is extroversion, and this one I think has been kind of mixed review, if I remember correctly. The difference here, it's considered helpful for athletes in general. The difference, or the nuance, is that within team sports, it tends to be a very positive trait, where if you're extroverted, you tend to socialize a bit more, and you're going to choose sports where you have a lot of teammates that you can interact with. And then you feed on that extroversion, where you're getting the social interaction with your teammates and your competitors, and then you're utilizing that to then motivate you to continue to push yourself and see how far you can go. Whereas somebody who's more introverted might thrive in individual sports as opposed to a team sport. So while they might struggle in something like soccer, they might do really well in tennis or golf. So extroversion is a bit of a mixed bag, but like I said, conscientiousness is really consistently shown for athletic success. Agreeableness, I put here in both the helpful and the hurtful columns, and this is because agreeableness is it's a bit dependent on the magnitude of it. So in general, what agreeableness means is how likely you are to avoid social conflict. So if you are an athlete and you are always avoiding social conflict, you're probably too passive to succeed in team sport. You're probably too passive to go out there and compete and really try to outdo your opponent. But if you are slightly agreeable and you're not too far, then it's not necessarily, okay, I'm Mr. Nice Guy, I'm going to let them just walk all over me. But you can have this sense of teamwork, camaraderie, where you're utilizing your teammates a lot more because you are agreeable. You're the selfless teammate, the role player that everybody wants on their team in a championship. Is you can't have a team full of Kobe Bryants, because you're just going to have people fighting and ball hogging, and everybody's going to be miserable. But you need to have a Kobe Bryant, plus you need to have somebody who's maybe setting the screens for him, or standing out in the corner to spread the floor. So these role players could be, they could have more athletic success if they are more agreeable. But it tends to be that the kind of superstars, if you will be less agreeable. Those personalities tend to be a little bit more maybe selfish. They tend to look for conflict, and they tend to kind of try to dominate both their teammates, their coaches, their opponents. So that disagreeable nature of the superstar athlete kind of, it really gives them the personality that they need in order to kind of embody that leadership, or the captain, if you will. So the last trait that is considered to be helpful in terms of athletic success is openness, and this is kind of a starting block, basically, where if you are open, basically the openness trait is openness to experience. So how willing are you to try new things? And so this really helps set the tone for athletes at a young age. If they're open to try a new sport, or open to try a new setting, or open to try new things within the course of play, then this allows them to kind of experiment and develop and practice over time. Whereas somebody who is less open, they're just rule followers from the beginning, and they never really develop their own kind of sense of play or style, if you will. So the openness trait, again, it might not be that it's a trait that is found in elite winners, but it can definitely set them down a path of success if it starts at a young age. Some other traits that are considered to be helpful in athletic success and are commonly discussed within the literature, but aren't necessarily those factor five model traits, are things like resilience, the ability to bounce back from adversity; optimism, the belief that anything bad will be followed up by something good. So if you're really in a struggle or a rut, or a slump, if you're in baseball, then the belief that you're going to get out of it, things will turn around, good things are coming. Optimistic athletes have this sense of, I'm a good athlete regardless of the outcomes that are happening around me right now. Just because I'm on a losing streak, or just because I'm in a slump, doesn't mean I'm a bad athlete or a bad team. It just means that we're in a little bit of a struggle. We just have to stick with it and keep pushing. And then that gives them the motivation to succeed on the back end of it. And then lastly would be accountability. So basically taking ownership for anything that's happening around them. And if something goes wrong, it was their fault. They're going to work to make it better the next time. Hurtful, on the other hand, neuroticism is the most commonly identified here. And this is a pretty strong one, because the athletes that have high sensitivity to emotions, they get caught up in the swings of sport. Obviously, sport is a very emotionally charged endeavor or phenomena, and so when things don't go their way, they struggle with their emotions too much to bounce back. When the game is on the line and there's a lot of nerves involved, and people are scared, or people are upset and angry and yelling, all the emotions that are packed into that moment really push these neurotic athletes beyond their I guess their peak, where they're performing at their best. So if they're too emotional, then they're going to struggle both in that moment and on the back end, in terms of, like I was saying with optimism, how do you look at the future? And so these athletes that have a lot of anxiety, or they have a lot of depression, they don't see the future as something that's bright and sunny. They see it as kind of cloudy, and they don't know necessarily if they have the potential to bounce back from it. And then, like I said, agreeableness to an extent can be a fault. If you're too agreeable and you're a pushover, then you're probably not going to have the guts to compete especially in a competitive or talented environment. Perfectionism is another one that's kind of interesting. And again, none of these traits are necessarily always helpful or always hurtful, but it's what's identified commonly. And perfectionism tends to be identified with traits, or with phenomena such as burnout, where these athletes never want to make mistakes. And anytime they make a mistake, they try so hard to outdo it that they end up just running themselves into the ground, and they end their own athletic journey because they're just so fatigued with trying to be perfect. So perfectionism it can be helpful to have because athletes are always trying to push themselves and get better. But this depends on kind of the context of why they're trying to be perfectionistic, whether they're just competing with themselves and they're doing it out of the love of development, or if they're doing it out of fear where they're trying to avoid making mistakes. Impulsivity is another one that's commonly identified. I don't necessarily know why this one is so strongly listed in the literature, but it's been commonly identified. I think what they're trying to say is that athletes that are kind of bouncing all over the place with their ideas, they don't stick with anything for long enough, and so that's that conscientious. It's basically the inverse of conscientiousness, where they stick with it no matter what. Whereas impulsivity, as soon as something gets hard, they're just going to kind of pivot or go into something else. And so that impulsivity, they don't stick with anything long enough to succeed. That would be my assumption. And then lastly would be arrogance. Obviously, this one, everybody knows the arrogant athlete who burns out too young. They think they're the best thing in the world at the age of 13, 14. But then after their peers start to catch up them, 15, 16, and now they're no longer the best, 17, 18, they don't know how to handle it. And so it can be really harmful in their development if they're too arrogant, if they think they're too good to learn or too good to continue to develop. So it's okay to be confident, but it crosses a line when you start to think that you're the best thing in the world and you can't get any better. So sport specific traits, these are things that are not necessarily within just the athlete as a whole, the athlete as a person. So if you take the athlete out of the sporting environment, they're going to have some of these what they would call the psychological core. And so those traits, things like openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, all of those traits are going to be things that tend to stick with them no matter where they are. So if you're extroverted or you really like social interaction, you probably like the social interaction no matter if you are at a party or if you are at a sporting event or if you're at school, wherever you are, you probably like the extroversion or you like being socialized. If you're introverted, you probably don't like to talk to people, whether you're at a party, at school, or at a sporting event. And so you tend to have some of these cores that stick with you. On the other hand, some of these kind of personality traits or what I would call sport specific traits are context dependent. So depending on where you are, you could be super confident. If you are training with your normal team, you have all your teammates around you, the coaches that you've known forever, your confidence could be through the roof. As soon as you change environments and you go to a new environment, you've got new teammates, new coaches, or a different level of competition. Maybe you're going from your regular team to the all-star team, and now you're no longer obviously the best person. So you're no longer as confident and sure of yourself. So some of these roles or these behaviors depend on the context around them. And this is particularly important with athletes because the environment is ever changing. So if your team's winning on a hot streak, right? Things are easy. There's no pressure. You've got the flow. Your team chemistry is at an all-time high. Your confidence is up. Your anxiety is down. Your fear is down. The pressure's down. Whereas if you're on a losing streak, it's just the inverse. It's your confidence is lacking. Your pressure is higher. Everybody's stressing, and then things become more challenging. So the environment definitely plays a role on not only the team but also the individual. So you get what you see is these core psychological core. They make up the bulk, but then you also have these kind of role related behaviors where, okay, when I'm at home with my family, I am the leader. Everybody looks to me and everybody follows what I say. But when I'm at the football team, now all of a sudden I'm the small guy that isn't really that talented and nobody really respects me. And so the roles that you fit into will depend on the environment as well. So things like leadership are definitely influenced by the sporting environment. Sport and performance anxiety can for sure be influenced by the environment. If you've got a crowd of 20 people versus if you've got a crowd of 20,000 people, that's going to play a big role in your perception of the pressure or the anxiety that's around you. Things like aggression are definitely sport specific because you have to balance the kind of dichotomy of aggression. Are you aggressive or are you not? You have to find that middle ground, what works for you and what works for your sport. If you're just going all out all the time, chances are you're probably not performing at your best. But if you're never aggressive, and again, if you're too passive or too agreeable, then you're probably getting walked over. And then the last one at the bottom here is moral disengagement. And this one's really interesting from a bigger picture kind of perspective. You step back and look at the sporting environment. I remember learning about this when I was in grad school and just thinking, wow, I never looked at sport in this lens. When you look through sport and you just kind of see the things that are norms within the sporting environment, things like physical contact. So in a game, any kind of a contact sport is perfectly normal and acceptable or even encouraged to just go up and put your hand on somebody's back and try to create space or occupy their space. It's completely normal to give a little push in their back. But imagine if you were at an airport or something and somebody's just like stood in front of the door where you're trying to go. It would not be encouraged for you to go up and just like grab them by the shirt and try to pull them back so you can get by, or try to use your hips to push them out of the way. Like some of these kind of sport specific rules or kind of cultural norms are definitely interesting when you look at it through a phenomena or through a lens of sporting culture versus moral disengagement. So things like cheating, for example, are often encouraged within the sporting and competitive environment. So it's definitely something to consider. Is one of the personality models talks about the honesty and humility index. So how moral is somebody, but that can be flipped as soon as they kind of go into that sporting environment where I'm no longer this person. I'm putting on, a lot of athletes will talk about, I'm putting on my game face, or I'm putting on this new persona, and I'm no longer Mr. Nice Guy. I'm going to do whatever it takes to win. And so that's kind of an interesting kind of thing to look at with the sporting environment. For the literature review this week, Richard Cox is the main author on the textbook Sport Psychology Concepts and Applications. I think this is a really old textbook, but it was one that I got a lot of value from because some of these concepts are a bit outdated, but the application is really interesting in how you're taking things like personality into the sporting environment. Things like the clutch gene or the hot streak, and what do you actually do with this? All these different phenomena that are kind of discussed regularly with amongst either athletes or fans. It breaks it down into realistic application and research, and it's all backed by evidence. So really, really fascinating read if you're into sports psychology literature. I'm going to butcher this name, but Renaud de Vries, he was the main author on a publication that was put out, and it's the main dimensions of sport personality traits. But this is a really interesting look at the kind of what I was describing earlier with the sport specific personality traits, where it talks about not only the personality as kind of an origin trait where you're born with this, or you kind of learn this as you're growing up, but also how sport is going to influence your personality. So basically it talks about how it's kind of a two-way street. Your personality kind of shapes which sports you're going to like, and then which sports you participate in shape your personality. So the two-way street is feeding into one another. And what they were discussing or describing was that the higher you get in competition, the more similar these personalities get to one another. Simply Psychology put out a really easy read, but it was a blog post talking about theories of personality. And so this breaks down the different models that we described earlier on in the presentation with the Factor 5 model or the Enneagram. And it basically just talks about the kind of creation of these different personality models. For media this week, the Nesta and Spencer Institute had a video called Personality in Sports and Physical Activity. This is a really, I would call like dense or like sports psychology heavy evidence-based approach, where they're discussing basically like different phenomena in sport, but then also like how athletes interact within the sporting environment. And then the second one is Dr. Jacob Gooden. I've mentioned his stuff before, and he's got a lot from the NSCA's CSCS, either the study course or the course material. And in this one, he was discussing the Big Five personality test. He's also got one on Enneagrams, and I believe he has one on the Myers-Briggs as well. So Dr. Jacob Gooden breaks down these personality tests and basically any of those CSCS topics into really easily understood YouTube videos. For this week's publication review, this was a paper from one of my favorite sports psychology researchers. His name's Daniel Gould out of Michigan State. And so him, and then I can't remember the co-author's name off the top of my head, but they did a qualitative interview with 10 U.S. Olympic champions. And specifically, they were looking at not just Olympic champions that were one-offs, but they had a combined 28 medals across their Olympic careers. So these were athletes that had longitudinal success. They had long length careers where they were consistently winning. So they were interviewing them, their parents, their siblings, their loved ones, and then their coaches as well. And so they basically asked them a handful of questions. It was a 60-minute to 150-minute guided interview, and they left room for the athlete or the other parents, coaches, to expand upon some of these questions. But effectively what they were getting at was, what was the development like for these psychological skills? How did you basically develop the mindset that you had that allowed you to win so long in the Olympic atmosphere? And they, prior to doing the interview, they sent the athletes basically a big packet that had the informed consent, but it also had mental skill or attribute assessments. And so there are 7 of these. So quite a lengthy process. I'm pretty amazed that 10 Olympic medalists would agree to do such a lengthy, even the interview alone took 1 to 2 hours out of their day. But then also filling out all these different assessments are a bit boring or dry with as much information and questionnaires that they're filling out. So fascinating that they were able to get this much information out of such a high level competitor, but really fascinating to see some of these responses. So some of the findings, they found that Olympic athletes consistently had, and again, this is taken in isolation, but it's viewed through the lens of their competitors. So what do their lesser counterparts have? And so these Olympic athletes had a better ability to cope with and control anxiety. So again, talking about the sport specific skills, being able to manage the pressure that they're experiencing, or you can look at the general trait and say, oh, they are less neurotic. And so they experienced less anxiety. So it's probably a double-edged sword where they're starting out with less trait anxiety and less neuroticism, but then they're also probably learning the mental skills to, okay, when I experience anxiety, what do I do? Whether that's breathing, whether that's self-talk, whatever it might be, they've learned these skills to then cope with and control their anxiety. Increased confidence. And again, does this come from their success in their sport? Probably. It's probably a two-way street where they're getting confidence from having success, but then they're also probably getting it from all the work they're putting in. They're probably reinforcing it through all the practice and time they're committing to it. So the longer their career goes, the higher level that they're able to compete at, their confidence probably goes up naturally. But that could also be something that they were born with, just having higher confidence. Mental toughness and resilience. I don't think there's any surprise there. The competitive athletic grind it takes a toll on everybody. So having mental toughness and resilience to be able to bounce back from some of the setbacks or adversity is definitely key for anybody in competitive sports. Sport intelligence, obviously that's a sport specific one where if you're a 100-meter sprinter, you don't really need that much sport intelligence. You're just going to get out and sprint. But something where you're doing hockey, for example, you definitely need to understand your sport a little bit better. The ability to focus and block out distractions. This is an interesting one. It's not necessarily a trait or a personality, but it's a skill that can for sure be learned. So it was interesting that they included this one in it. Competitiveness, again, this kind of goes hand in hand with agreeableness, where maybe they just are very disagreeable people, and so then that trait agreeableness doesn't hold them back, or they don't get pushed over or pushed around or walked over, and they're really fighting for what they believe in, and so that's the competitiveness trait. Similarly, they had hard work ethic, and that goes hand in hand with the conscientiousness trait. So they are putting in these long hours. They know what they're working toward, and they're going to stay consistent with it, no matter what they experience along the way. The ability to set and achieve goals, that would be another one that ties into conscientiousness, where they know what their goals are, and they know the work that it takes to get there. So they're setting these high goals, but then they're doing the work to achieve it. Coachability, I think this one for me is basically the openness trait, where you're not arrogant and you don't shut off your ability to develop. They're lifelong learners, so they're open to new techniques or strategies that are going to help them perform better. So being able to be coached is definitely a good trait to have for anybody who's looking to compete at the highest level. High levels of dispositional hope. This is effectively optimism, but a different way of saying it. So it's kind of their mood. It's not necessarily I'm optimistic that I'm going to score more points next game. It's just their attitude. Like when they walk around with life, they just have this kind of sense that I hope things are going to get better, or I think things will get better. And then the last one that they identified within this paper was the adaptive perfectionism. And we talked about this a bit, but the key here is adaptive perfectionism. They're trying to get better. They're trying to really just achieve that perfection, as opposed to trying to avoid making mistakes, which we all know is impossible. The last of the findings here, so the this is where it comes down to the kind of one, the coach's perspective, but then also like the larger system or environment. So they found that the coaches and the families were the biggest influences on the athletic development, specifically with the psychological skills. So the the athlete is influenced by a million different things. That's the community, all their friends, all their teammates, all their teachers that are around them, their non-sport personnel, whether that's doctors or I'm trying to think of another example of that, but anybody who's around them that's not necessarily involved with coaching or sport development. And then obviously the development staff, their strength and conditioning coaches, sport scientists if they have them, medical staff, anybody in those groups, they're all playing a role in their psychological development. It just so happens that the coaches and the family members who are likely the closest with them have the largest influences. The one of the things that they noted was that it wasn't always a direct style of teaching them psychological skills. The athletes were able to learn both direct and indirect. So a couple of examples that they gave were coaching. So the coach is actually telling you, hey, I want you to practice mental toughness, and here's how we're going to do it, versus modeling. And so they just show the athlete like, hey, when something bad happens to me, that's okay. I'm going to move on. I'm going to bounce back. I'm going to stay resilient, and I'm going to stay optimistic that the future is brighter. So you don't necessarily have to tell them this is what we're going to do. Just by being in that environment and seeing other people have success with something, they're going to start to kind of imitate or copy it. And then the last piece that the authors mentioned were the practical implications. So the systems approach was huge. And so they were saying it shouldn't just be the coaches that are talking to them about psychological skills development. It takes a village, as they say. The whole community, the parents, the siblings, the significant others, all of these individuals can have an influence on the mindset of the athlete. And so the author suggested training the coaches and the family members particularly to essentially foster these psychological skills that are considered beneficial, things like conscientiousness or mental toughness. And then the last focus was that psychological skills are not just a short-term practice. You don't just try them once and then all of a sudden you're good at them. It's a long-term development, and it takes a long time to refine, practice, and start to recognize the scenarios in which you need to apply them, but then also apply them correctly. So, to summarize, there are a million different models of personality, a few of which are more correlated with scientific origin, and and you can expand your research upon it kind of as you will, but most of them tend to gravitate toward the factor five model because it's so scientifically validated. There are considered to be helpful and hurtful traits in the research, but it's not always a helpful or hurtful. It is case dependent and depends a lot on the environment that's around them. And then the last piece is that the sport environment definitely plays a role on the personality that the athletes have. And so your basically your system is shaping all the athletes that are in it. So being mindful of how you're creating the system, the environment for these athletes to develop can play a big role in the development of their psychological skills. So that, like I said, that was the last of the sports psychology meetings. So the next one will be starting nutrition, and the first subtopic within nutrition is going to be weight management. So we'll talk a little bit about kind of different strategies for if athletes are trying to bulk up and trying to gain weight, or if they're trying to cut down and lose some weight, specifically with body composition or with competition guidelines such as wrestling weight classes. Hope to see you all there and enjoy until then.